Hello and welcome to episode 98 of Retropower Uncut. So scarily, it's only one more until we get to the big 100. I think there's been a few suggestions coming in about what we do for episode 100. I think we've got some ideas. We were wondering about maybe doing a little interview with every member of staff as perhaps something to be a bit different from the average episode. We could talk about what cars everybody has then, although we did think, we could show everybody's cars, but all the staff's cars, but in reality, actually choreographing everybody to bring their cars all at once is going to be nigh on impossible, especially as half of them probably don't actually work. So certainly with mine, that's the case. Right, we're going to start with Land Cruiser. So that's the one with the big transformation this week. Last week, John was just tackling some of the jobs that were going to be an awful lot easier before the body went on. So we were routing the battery cable and the brake lines down the chassis leg. We actually decided to put them down the leg itself as probably the safest place in terms of getting damaged at all. So they've been routed down there. We've also put the clips along there for the wiring loom, and that gets routed down there. Brake plumbing is almost completely done actually. I think John was just starting the flexi lines last week, so he's finished flexi lines on the axles, the one that runs all the way down the chassis leg to the back. We've got AP brake bias valve mounted at the back. It's just nice to have a means of varying the braking to the rear wheels when you've done a brake conversion. So this is now on MR2 calipers and I think it's 70 series Land Cruiser discs on the back. So obviously the front brakes are different as well, so there could be a variation front to rear, plus the master cylinder is different as well. So having a means of reducing the brake pressure on the back is always wise in case you find there's too much braking on the rear wheels. So I'll put a valve in there which will get adjusted until we've perfected everything and then locked off. And that pretty much concluded all the things we wanted to do before the body went on, and that tied in really well with the torque converter arriving, which was kind of the missing piece of the puzzle in terms of being able to get the gearbox onto the engine on the chassis, which we really wanted to do before putting the body on. It is possible to do it after, but it's just way easier before. So we got the gearbox mated up, got the engine on the chassis, and then did the precarious job of getting the relatively built up body onto the chassis, which we came up with because anywhere you can lift the body on that is actually robust enough to take the weight of it, especially with it fairly built up at the minute with the glass and roof, etc. They're all positions that then need to go onto the chassis, so you can't really lift it anywhere. And we talked about literally manhandling it with like maybe eight guys around it just on the bodywork, but I didn't really like how controllable that was going to be. So what we actually did in the end was we put some seatbelt eye bolts into these seatbelt anchorage points in the floor, put a strap around those, and actually got the forklift with tine extensions in through the back of it. Under the straps, I put a pad along the sort of floor at the back, so the forks would rest on that pad, and so because it was slightly front heavy, so it would be trying to tip forwards, and that actually worked really well. It means that we could really carefully lower it down, get it all lined up, plonk straight onto its mounts, everything lined up. That went really well. So the body's now fully mounted. And then very rapidly we'll be able to get all the front end together. Would probably be together already if it wasn't for the usual curse that always plagues just about every car build we do, where you build everything up in metalwork, absolutely sure it's right, and then something mysteriously changes by the time you get it in here. So at the moment, for some reason, the wings are actually sitting a little bit high, even when they're in their lowest position. So we're just elongating the slot. There's slotted holes in the brackets that hold the wings. We're just elongating those slots slightly so we can just bring them down. But it is very strange. We wonder whether it's the extra weight maybe, because there's a bit more weight in it now, and maybe that's flexing the chassis up slightly, or maybe even the chassis has been distorted, but seems highly unlikely. It's extremely heavy duty box section that chassis is made from, but whatever the matter, those wings are needing a little tweak now to get them to line up. But very soon we'll have both the wings on, we'll get the upper sections in, front panel on, and then we're going to be into the things that we've wanted everything together to complete. So the radiator is one of the first things. We wanted to get the engine and everything together so we could put the mock-up radiator or the original radiator in there and mark where our new top hose position is going to be, and bottom hose for that matter, so we can then send that away as a pattern to Concept Racing, who are going to do an aluminium one for us. We're going to integrate a little heat exchanger into that for the transmission cooling as well. That'll be in the bottom tank of the radiator. So yeah, really, really exciting phase. I mean, it's been good sort of seeing this come together for a while, but it's nice to get it to this stage. You'll notice the doors are off, and that we took all the doors off just to get a bit more weight out of the body because it's not a big job. But coincidentally, the front door hinges that we've had machined have arrived. They came today. So we're going to do a trial fit of those, make sure they're fine, and then they'll go through to paint. We've done those in stainless. We did the rear door hinges that we designed in aluminium. But the front ones, there's quite a thin, on the sort of car half of it, there's two little thin sections that come out and hold the door half of the hinge. And we were a little bit worried that in aluminium they weren't going to be strong enough, and you couldn't really beef up the thickness because of the constraints of where they fit. So we decided to do those in stainless steel, stainless rather than mild, just because where the bushes go, the whole point of doing them as a machine part really was so we could introduce bronze bushes, so there's no steel on steel and you didn't get any rust staining coming out. And we were a little bit worried that if we fitted the bushes after paint, we might damage the paint and you might get the same problem, and didn't really want to have paint going up onto the bushes. Thought that might look a bit odd as well. So I think we've got a reasonable plan there, and they look beautiful. Andy at Concept 303's machine those, as he does with a lot of our stuff. So that's that. Mustang. Adam's been basically slaving away with wiring. It's just a constant slog, and actually a reminder as to why we normally do wiring the way we do, where we completely bespoke design the loom. We normally get Max at Bremax to do the loom builds for us to kind of military spec, which sometimes we do a slightly reduced spec where the sleeving inside the car is just sort of slip over braided sleeving when it's unnecessary to be a motorsport spec. But in this instance, we were using a generic, it's an American Auto wire loom, and it's a generic loom, it's not specifically for a Mustang. Which on the surface of it does seem like a good idea. It was supplied to us by our customer. But the thing is, the amount of time in then modifying everything, shorten everything, looming everything up, terminating everything, because everywhere you shorten something, even if there was already a connector on there, it's got to be re-terminated, and in most cases, because it's generic, there weren't connectors. There's a huge amount of work involved, and ultimately, all you've really got for the price of the loom is basically a fuse box and some wire, and the wiring into the fuse box having already been done, which realistically isn't a massive amount of work. So I certainly, sorry American Auto Wire, but I would certainly question the value of buying a generic loom. I mean, if you're doing it at home, perhaps, and you're doing it in your own time, it makes sense if time is not a cost. But when time is a cost, it's not really an effective way of doing a loom. It might as well be bespoke design. Anyway, it is going really well, despite that slight moan about the value of a generic wiring loom. It is getting there now. He's just tying up the connections to the wiper switch. What else is he doing? The headlight switch. We've been doing the wiring to the HVAC unit, and most of it needs modifications and changes. So, for instance, there is a single feed out for HVAC power, but because on these they've got a separate aircon unit and a separate heater, you've got to modify it because there's power going to both of those. Same with like the wiper setup. We're using a different wiper motor. So it's not, the wires that are already there aren't going to work exactly with the wiper motor that we're working with, so we're going to have to do some changes there and introduce some new wires. But yeah, very, very, very close now. I think another couple of days on this and the wiring will be pretty much buttoned up. And then yeah, we're into the final details. I think seats are really the critical remaining one, and then choosing some nice wheels for it, and we'll be getting close to test drive. Morris. John's been on that a fair bit. He's buttoned up the remaining fuel plumbing underneath. Last week he was finishing off the fuel vent plumbing and doing the brace bar, or trial fitting the brace bar that sits on the subframe. He's just finished the fuel plumbing to the pump, because we couldn't do that until we'd finished the tank. So basically the tank to pump plumbing and the return line that goes back to the tank, which go underneath. He's finished those, and then we've been mocking up the prop shaft. So because it's essentially all MX5, but the rear subframe has been brought forward by, it's somewhere in the order of 2 inches compared to an MX5, and we did that by modifying the backbone that joins the gearbox and the subframe to allow it to come slightly closer. consequently the prop's a little bit shorter than an MX-5 prop, so we've just tacked up a cut and shut basically, and tacked up as a mock-up a spare MX-5 prop we had, and we're now going to send that along with an original one to Dave Mack Props in Coventry, who do all of our prop shafts, and they'll basically properly shorten the standard prop to match the length of our mock-up prop. So yeah, looking forward to getting that back, and actually with that back and that brace back on, I think that's almost all of the underside stuff buttoned up. So yeah, we're looking good on that. I'm just waiting for those billet tanks in the engine bay, and that will allow us to really bash through a load of progress on the interior then. Stratos was pretty cool to see the sort of rear window panel taking shape. Rich was working on that, laying that up in fiberglass on the MDF tooling we had machined, and that's looking good now. He's kind of taken it to a stage I'm happy with, so it's representative of the final item. So for testing, you know, it'll have the amount of airflow we want to see to establish whether that's sufficient, basically. So I'm going to stop short of actually prepping and painting that to its final finish, in case we need to make any changes, you know, in case it doesn't allow enough air through, in case there's any other complications with it, you know, with the heat that's going to be under it, whether that'll distort it or whatever. So hopefully we'll all be good, but it's wise for us to stop at this point, test it, make sure there's no changes to that, and then we'll be painting that. I think that's going to go gloss black, and the glass for that should be coming back tomorrow, I believe. Yeah, so that's good. We've got the air intake ears kind of roughly on there at the minute as well. We modelled those a while ago. We're actually going to make some visual changes to those. That was a sort of first stab at them, and although I'm happy with the amount of intake area we've got, customer was saying maybe a few changes, and I kind of agree. It's that the car's a little more angular than they are. They're a bit more organic, and so we're going to do a slightly more angular version. Probably tapers in more at the back, and then they'll probably end up being body coloured. And then the other thing's the flank vents. If you remember, we wanted to have the final paint on the rear clam before we re-scanned and did the final design for those. So George has done the final design, printed both sides, printed the mounting plates that go underneath to mount them. They're fully in place as a trial measure, so they'll actually be fine for testing purposes to see how much airflow we get through. That's no problem at all. We are going to do the final versions machined in black nylon, so that you don't have the sort of layering effect you get from 3D print. But the prints will be fine in terms of testing, so that's good. And I think we're about to start design work on the front infill piece here, which is going to mimic the same louver design as those flank vents. So yeah, watch this space on that. I'm actually going to touch on what's lurking here. Absolutely scruffy by the standards of everything else in here, but you might have noticed that the body shop progress seemed a little thin on the ground over the last sort of week. Now Nat didn't touch on this. This is actually mine. Nat didn't touch on it because it was in the booth, and I don't think it wasn't in his field of vision. But while we had a car that was coming back for a little bit of paint work, and the customer actually cancelled that appointment, so we had basically a week and a half more or less free in the body shop, apart from the CV8 progress. So I did something I've been wanting to do for a while, and basically snuck my own car in to take it from its faded pink paint and lacquer peeling finish that it's had for so many years, since I've had it really, to get a decent coat of paint on it. So yeah, the guys have done an awesome job. It's very dusty sat here now, but I'm hoping now to get this back together. But inevitably what will actually happen is I'll now not have time to finish building it back up, and it'll just sit here probably until it's faded and paint peeling again. But hopefully not. So one day maybe you'll see me actually fire this up and drive it around again, as I probably did for the last time about 3 years ago, I think. So yeah, that's that for this half. I'll pass over to Nat, and he can show you what's going on in the metal workshop, and I'll see you next week for episode 99. Right, well, thanks Cal, and here we are in the metal shop for another bit of Retropower Uncut on the dark side. We're starting off again with Project 1 Mark 1 Escort, and we've done a few jobs dotted around all over the shop on this. We started the week with myself, Scott and Tom all working on it, and then Scott quite quickly went on to another job. And so it's been myself and Tom then working on initially together, and then a bit further on our separate parts of making progress in a few areas on this. We started the week with Scott doing some work in the back end, finishing off the inner arch tubs, finish welding the inner arch tubs into the sides of the floor, trimming up the sides of the floor and tidying all that up.
finishing off various parts of the inner arches, and then we did a bit of measuring up and marked out the cuts for the rear floor, and Scott got the rear floor all cut out, so we got room for the access for fitting the rear subframe into the chassis. In the meantime, I drew up the jig fixtures for mounting the subframe to the select jig. So I drew up the rear legs and the front legs for that. I'd actually already drawn the front legs, but I drew up the rear legs for that. And then I checked those drawings over, made sure I hadn't made any silly mistakes, and then Tom fabricated those. So Tom fabricated the rear legs and the front legs for mounting the subframe into the car, which went well. Everything lined up. We got the laser on it, checked everything lined up. That was all good. We're within 2mm worst case on anything, but pretty much 1mm everywhere, so happy with that. That's plenty good enough. There's more flex than that in the shell, so we're good enough on that. So we got that done, and then with that done and the subframe then bolted in using the aluminium dummy bushes, which you may remember from previous episodes. We use those instead of the rubber bushes, the polyurethane bushes, A, so we don't set fire and ruin the polyurethane, and B, so that everything's completely solidly in the correct location during the fabrication, so that later on we've not had a bush flexed at the point of doing the fabrication work and thus pull things into the wrong place. So subframe's in. That's all bolted in place. With that bolted in place, I could then measure up for the brackets to bracket that to the chassis. Now what we do is we make the jig legs, the attachment points for the jig legs, to bolt to one side of the bush, the dummy bushes effectively. They're like a cotton reel type bush. They're actually a leaf spring shackle bush I'm using. And what we do is we make the jig to bolt to one side of it so that the other side is free, or at least that just has the bolt head, so we can withdraw the bush on that one mount. There are 4 mounts. We can withdraw the bush on that one mount, make a bracket, bolt the bracket to the other end, and then weld that bracket to the body shell, and at that point we can take the jig leg away and unsupport the other end of the bush, and the subframe doesn't move and everything's locked in place. So we've done that, fabricated the first 4 shear plate brackets, which are then welded in place on the, I always forget this bit, on the trailing edge of the rear bush mounts and on the trailing edge of the front bush mounts. So we've still got to do the brackets on the forward edge of the front bush mounts. The rear ones, on the rear set of mounts, but the front side of those is actually supported by the lower part of the suspension turret. So that's the next stage, which we're working on at the moment. So that pretty much covers where we were at the back. As I say, Scott was doing various little bits of sheet metal finishing off in there. Also earlier in the week, Tom did a bit of fabrication work in the engine bay, and he welded in the gussets, the chassis rail to bulkhead reinforcement gussets, which are a pretty much standard fitment on any Escort rally car. It's been a standard reinforcement since Ford Borum did them way back in the day, and it's just a sensible point to stop the chassis rails kinking where they flex against the bulkhead. It's not an amazing modification because you're just feeding stress into part of the bulkhead that's not very well supported anyway, so it does just flex the bulkhead. But it does spread a key stress raiser, because that is a very high stress point where the chassis rail and the inner wing and the bulkhead all meet. So it does just spread the stresses around there and stop the stress concentration that would cause cracking on the inner wing where the chassis rail meets it. So it's a good modification to do, and it makes the corner of the engine bay just look a bit tidier as well, as a total aside, because it's a real dirt trap, that corner. So if you weld a gusset into it, it doesn't get full of dirt. So that's done. There's a little bit of cutting out happened in the front panel, not too much yet, because as I mentioned last week, we had a bit of an oopsie with the radiators. The oopsie is being corrected with the radiators, but the radiator story has also taken a slight twist in that Cal and myself went through some of the more detailed checks on the plan for the plumbing. And after a few around the houses sort of evolutions of the plan, we've decided to go for water to oil heat exchanging on this engine for various reasons. Chiefly, we can't fit an air to oil cooler in, but secondly, having done a bit of thinking and stepping back from the problem and turning our back on what everybody does and looking at what we should do rather than what everybody does, actually it makes more sense to go water to oil heat exchange as long as you've got enough water radiator capacity, because it warms your oil up faster and the engine's better on warm up. And for a road car, that's actually quite a valuable thing. It's actually quite important to get the oil up to temperature quickly. So we're going for oil to water heat exchange, but we weren't very keen on the type that you see on a lot of production cars that just fit onto the oil filter. There's various reasons we didn't want to do that. and a lot of people will be familiar with the lamin-over type cooler. Unfortunately on that, the flow directions are wrong to make the plumbing neat. And what we've actually decided to do is use, and I've forgotten what they're referred to as, I think they're generally referred to as an in-tank oil cooler, but it's basically a plate type cooler that's designed to be immersed in coolant. So the oil passes through plates with turbulators inside, a stack of plates, a bit like an oil to air cooler, but they're actually designed to be, well, they're generally fabricated in stainless steel or very, very carefully anodized aluminium, and they're designed to be built inside a tank. And what we're actually planning to do is in the bottom of the radiator do a billet section machined, which is welded into the bottom of the radiator and the side of the bottom tank of the radiator, and then a billet plate which bolts in, which has the pipe fittings through it to carry the oil cooler and build the oil cooler into the bottom tank of the radiator. That's the plan now. It makes the plumbing much neater and gives us effectively the preheat on the oil that was actually going to be quite important on a fairly highly tuned engine fitted in a car that's chiefly going to be used as a road car. The other development was a bit of planning ahead in that both of these builds are also, both of the two Escort builds are also having air conditioning. That also added a bit of complication, A, to the plumbing and B, to the engine auxiliary planning. And the culmination of that, a load of noise in the background, the culmination of that was that we are going to go for electric air conditioning compressors and big alternators to power them, mainly to simplify the belt run on the front of the engine and also to remove a few possible pitfalls in terms of the belt run on the front of the engine and things that could go wrong, and space constraints as well. On the BD, there isn't an awful lot of space around the front of the engine to put big rotating bits of equipment other than where the alternator ideally wants to go. So we're going to pass the load to the alternator and do it that way. So that's where we're at with that lot. Dry sump tank fabrication will, well, the tank itself will follow further down the line, but the fabrication in order to fit it will be coming just as soon as we have the radiator to enable us to do the fabrication to fit the radiator. So there's a bit of a knock-on effect there, but that's progress for the future. Moving on, still with this car, I'm going to wander over here and make Jamie's life difficult because his gimbal's playing up. We'll go to this. It's a bit of a messy bench because I haven't tidied up. I've had no chance. It's an uncut episode, so that's what you get. It's uncut. There's no pre-tidying happened. Right, these uprights for the back of the Escort. They're a Land Rover Freelander 1 upright. I managed to get 3 new. I've got to get 1 second hand, annoyingly. We modify them by cutting the lower mount off. As you can see, I've probably talked a lot about these in the past, but never actually held one up in front of a camera. They take a very big wheel bearing, which is nice. That's the wheel bearing, Freelander wheel bearing. It's actually compatible with a lot of trailers as well. But it also has a built-in ABS trigger ring, which is quite nice in that if we want ABS or we need to do any wheel speed sensing, we have the sensor position. That's actually a different one. Yeah, but we do have this. We have the facility to fit the sensor. It actually goes into a different drilling, which isn't drilled on these particular uprights. But yeah, we have this. We have the option to fit a sensor, and we also have the bearing with the trigger ring in it, so that we've got that option to do without having to fit separate trigger rings. So that's quite nice. Bearing goes in there. The little jobs that have been done on this are making some press fit sleeves to sleeve these strut mount bolts, which were M14, to sleeve them down to M12, because M14 is just ludicrous. They would never have needed to be an M14 even on a Freelander, let alone when they're fitted to an Escort. I mean, you will never shear a pair of M12s off, so they'll be more than strong enough. And the other thing is that this bottom bolt was an M12 on these uprights originally, so they were 12mm holes. But with the spherical bearing, or the rod ends that we're using on there, which are these, which are generally the really high quality ones, are generally available only in imperial sizes because they're aimed at the aircraft industry. We need to fit a pair of those, that way around actually, to either side of that upright. And they're 1/2-inch bore, and I'd rather not have silly adapters and things, so we set these up in the milling machine and ream out those holes all the way through to 1/2 inch instead of M12, and then the bottom pin here that holds these on will be machined from a piece of 1/2-inch OD EN24 bright bar, EN24T bright bar, and held on with a lock nut one end and but basically a Loctited on lock nut on one end and just a normal nylock nut on the other end, and that'll form the bottom pivot point to tighten these rose joints up onto there. So that's that lot. And then just as an aside, it's not really a job that's been done, but it's a job that's in the pipeline, is these are the hubs we use, which are available new. They're a Mark 1 Mondeo front hub, the 4-stud Mondeo front hubs. These obviously don't fit that. So, and the wall thickness is a little bit thin to do that as a one-stage sleeve. So what we do is we actually take a bit of a cut off here to skim this to an exact size, and then we machine a shrink on fit sleeve which goes over that, and we Loctite and heat shrink. Well, we basically heat that, freeze this, Loctite it, drop on a sleeve, shrink onto the hub, to then the bearing is then the requisite press fit over that. But when we remove it, it leaves the sleeve behind on the hub. So if you ever have to press the wheel bearing off or to do any maintenance there, which you shouldn't have to do with that bearing, but if you did, when you remove it, it doesn't take the sleeve off the hub. So that's the idea there. That all worked. That worked really well on Gordon's. We were very happy with it. And then through all of that, I haven't actually got one to hand. Actually, I have, but it's buried in that box, so I'm not going to... In fact, I can. I can get it, so I'm going to... In this box here is the CV joint, which is this is an SKF one, just to complete the structure, because we never really actually showed this in detail before. But that is a Mark III Mondeo V6 or Mark I Focus RS CV joint, which is a pretty big, sensible spline, easy enough to cut the spline CV joint, which is very strong and exactly fits the back of a Freelander hub. As you can see there, it's a really, really nice fit in a Freelander hub. So we use that, which also fits a Mark I Mondeo hub like that, with the bearing with the sleeve in the middle, and then you end up with that pretty neat packaged setup with big CV joint, big bearing, all really strong, strut off the top, rotor joints on the bottom, pretty simple, neat, nice, easy to package, low axle centre line in the suspension height. Geometry all works out nicely, everything works, and that's that lot. So you can see how that lot comes together. This is the rear turret setup, where I think I've given somebody some instructions slightly wrong here. These should be bolted on 180 degrees round from where they are, which is why they don't look right. I think I failed in my instructions there. That's my fault. But they're bolted on 180 degrees round from where they should be. But they're the rear turret main sections, which are made in 3mm steel, and they form the back of the suspension turret. And these parts make these flat sections, when they're fitted the other way around, they mate up with the inner arches each side, and basically set up the rear end of the car correctly. Oh, I see what's happened there. Yeah, they've been bolted into the wrong holes. That's why they are as they are. But yeah, they're the main turret section. So the next stage on this, now we've got this little jig bar holds the strut centres on the correct separation. That holds those 705mm separation. Sorry, 705 across these holes. Can't remember the exact separation across the strut top centres. Basically, that holds the strut top centres on the correct separation. We then make another little bar with two uprights here, which holds this lot, and then we can tack weld that inside the inner quarters of the car, and it holds the strut tops in the correct place, dead on centre of the axle centre line at the correct height for the struts, and then we can actually fabricate the outer part of the turrets, which is actually this way around, not that way around because they're on wrong. And that gives us the turret structure into the back of the car. That cuts through the chassis rail, we weld that into the chassis rail, build the new chassis rail around the bottom of the turret, and that's pretty much that. Then we just build a bulkhead around it and it's all done, just like that. So that's where we are on that. I'm going to walk this way over to Churchill. As I'm going that way, I'm going to we saw the Nitron strut units last week. I'm just going to grab one now. We've put a bit of masking around them to protect them a bit. That's one of them with the springs stripped off and the other bit stripped off. Sorry, I'm making Jamie's life really difficult here now. Just realised. But I'm going to move that across there and just show you that everything's going to fall everywhere. But that is the Nitron rear strut unit, and that the plates have closed up slightly, but basically that will, I'm not going to put it up completely into position, but that is basically, that goes on there and that forms the rear strut unit. I'm not going to push it on completely because it's fairly tight and I'll struggle to get it back off again on video. And then we have the puck units that set the camber, which drop into there, which I'm just waiting for at the moment, because I forgot to order them, is the long and short of that. So yeah, that's where we're at with that lot. So over to Churchill. Stu's principally, we'll go this way around. I'm keeping Jamie right on his toes. Past this, Rich has just done I bought this the other week. This is a little bit of metalworking kit that I'd been looking for a while, a double bic holder. We use, all of our little anvils are all hardy hole ones. We haven't got a proper anvil. They're stupidly expensive, and for the amount we'd actually use it, it's not really worth paying the money for one. But hardy hole anvils are really useful, and basically I've made a little hardy hole holder there on this stake that we use for holding all sorts of things, but quite often there are two that you want and you're up forever interchanging them. And then I spotted this on eBay the other day, and really usefully we can now fit two hardy hole units, and they're really high, so you can actually work at nice eye level and do neat work without crouching down and grovelling around on the floor. So we're quite happy with that. It's quite a neat little setup. So as I'm passing it, I thought I'd bring that into the mix as well. But yeah, Stu's been working on with quarter panel. Which side was he working? Was he on? I was going to say he's been doing a bit on both, hasn't he? He's had. There's been a bit of to and fro, and he's been finishing the quarter panel and the rear section for the outer quarter this side. But while he was doing that and checking for symmetry, he discovered a bit of a problem on the inner wheel arch, where when he had done the final shaping on this, it had actually pulled the arch lip slightly low in the middle, which he hadn't realised had occurred. And he was checking the fit of the outer, discovered that the inner had actually pulled down and moved his outer arch down. So he's been revising that and sorting that out and truffling that. He's had to split that, take a little section out and move that back up to get the arch to line up exactly where he wanted it. But other than that, he's pretty much there with all the alignment on the back of this. I'm thinking next week, hopefully, he should be in a position to be getting the outer quarter pretty much on. I'm just looking around because I don't actually know where the outer quarter's gone. It's disappeared somewhere. I don't quite know where he's put it, but hopefully it'll be fairly close to being in a position to get the outer quarter in place, and then he's got to start the fettling work on A, putting the arch lip into it, then B, doing the finishing of the sill, finishing off the inside back part of the sill and all the detail work around there. So yeah, basically, it's a bit brief on Churchill because it's kind of more of the same, but we're carrying on with the quarter panel work, which is quite an in-depth job. And on the subject of quite in-depth jobs of making quarter panels, I've been promising it for a while, and I've not had the chance to do it for quite a while. And it's the usual scenario of far more to do than we have hours in the day to enable. But hopefully next week we're going to try and film an autofocus episode on metal shaping. Probably the first of a couple, and definitely only giving a flavour, not going into too much depth, because I'm not the most qualified person to go into that much depth. There are plenty, I'm qualified enough to realise that there are plenty more qualified people in the country than me. And also just because I bore half of you I bore to death, and the other half I wouldn't go into enough detail, so I'll be on hiding to nothing. But what we'll do is we'll go into a reasonable bit of detail, a good light skim through the principles of how we would shape the panels on this car, the principle of what we do, the order we do things in, and why we do what we do to make the metal take on the forms that it does. So we're going to try and do that next week, which will tie in quite nicely to this car, because a lot of the shots that we use will be from making the various panels for this car. There'll be some other bits as well, but a lot of it's been quite a good case study, because a lot of the shapes that are on this car are the ones that you would come across in normal work. You've got a hugely crowned panel like this inner arch where there's an enormous amount of shape, and you're really pushing the amount you can stretch and shrink metal to the limit. And then there's the opposite extreme of the door skins, which are almost flat, and you have a totally different set of difficulties when you're working with a panel like that. You've got incredibly subtle shaping and incredibly unsubtle shaping, both on the same car, and they're both challenges in their own respects. So we'll have a little delve into that next week. I think on Churchill we'll leave that at that for this time. Jamie's nodding this way. I'm going to go this way, yes. He'll probably get wrapped up on this next. I've left weapons there to get tangled up. Yeah, I'm going to point quickly over there because Tom is just having a little practice with the tube bender. It might not even be a practice, it might be an actual part now, but he's just getting set up for making the lower dash support rail for the Project 1 Escort, because Tom's now moved on. We've got some shots of some plasma cutting going on, and I'd forgotten about this bit. Tom's actually setting to on the dashboard fabrication for the Project 1 Escort, which again, most of the key elements of are actually drawn from the Gordon Murray Escort build, because actually we were incredibly happy with the dash design in that, and the vast bulk of it's going to be pretty much a copy of that. Not the detail would be different, but the metalwork will be the same. That said, it's not just a case of, oh, there we go, we'll just pop another one out of the pod. It was all handmade, and the only drawings we had were for the two binnacle sections that were done on CAD. All of the rest of it, Stu just made up by hand from his head, and we have no drawings. So again, it's going to be a lot of visual work and metal shaping to photographs and to ideas in our heads. So that's where that's going. And then moving on into here, I'll move the curtain so Jamie can get in. We have Dustville, Tennessee. And lots of things going on in lots of areas, but principally the main focus being Jensen CV8. And quite a lot's moved on this week because Gaz and Mark mainly, I think Steve's mainly been on bits of Jensen anyway. Oh, no, I tell a lie, sorry. I'll step back from that. Steve's actually been working quite a lot on the Chevette parts that we touched on last week. Steve had actually done a lot of work on the prep work for the Chevette rally car front air dam and bumper and wings repair that you saw us doing last week. They're all now done. I think Steve did the bulk of the prep on those with a bit of help from Mark, and then Mark painted them yesterday, didn't he? Yeah, Mark put the base coat and lacquer on them yesterday, so they're pretty much, other than a tiny fettle here and there, they're basically ready to go back to go on a rally car again. Hopefully, we'll see how long they last, but hopefully the owner might be looking at getting some new panels moulded for that, which will sort of fit properly as per the panels that are on it now, rather than needing quite so much work each time. So that was one job out of the way, and then onto this, we've been most of the hands to the pumps really on the CV8 then. I mentioned last week that Tom had made with help from Rich doing the spacer blocks and Gaz giving him a hand as well. We've made the aluminium front screen surround, and I said that we were going to do an aluminium rear screen surround. Well, the rear aluminium screen surround is now part of the body shell and is fared in and not too far off the right shape really. That's all gone well. The plan went well on that. Gaz has been doing some work on the doors. We had a little bit of a fettle to do because the doors, we would call it going hollow. Basically, again, we'll touch on this in metal shaping on the autofocus, but basically the doors had gone from being almost entirely flat at the bottom, as they should have been. There's barely any crown to the lower part of the doors on one of these. They've gone from barely any crown to actually gone slightly hollow on the crown where the doors had been crimped round. So we had to take them off and get Tom to just tap them up a little bit to just lift that back to being flat rather than hollow. It's only a tiny bit. You're probably talking maybe 2 millimeters or so in the middle of the panel. But if you don't get them out by that small amount, then you have to basically fill it with filler, which we're a bit keen not to do. Gaz wasn't mad keen about doing that, nor are we. So they've been tapped up, brought up now, and Gaz has given them a skim. They're still skimmed with filler, don't get me wrong. You see a lot of flannel on the internet about, there's no filler in that. Now, that can be done. It's certainly possible. There are cars out there in that situation. But realistically, to take all the minor little defects out, you are going to have a skim of filler on panels like that, and there's a very thin skim. It's a very thin skim. You can pretty much see the metal through it everywhere, but it nonetheless has a full panel skim and then full block back. And that's what's been done on that door, and that's what will be done on the other door for this side. Once that's all finalised, Gaz can then finish the blend from that door into the quarter panel, which he's got pretty close. I haven't actually looked at it today, but it was pretty close the other day when I looked. We also yesterday had Pete from KS Composites visit. A two-pronged attack, one to do with the BMW project, but also two to do with the CV8, to have a look at this and hold our hands a bit in terms of areas we needed to look at and things we needed to do prior to this going over to KS for the moulds to be taken. He pointed out a few things in terms of radius details that would make it easier to get a mould, extraneous bits that we really didn't need to have on the car anymore, and things like that. So he's pointed us in the right direction on that, and we've started working through the things that came up in that conversation. George had scanned those sections of the back of the car, basically scanned the whole back of the car, so that we've got the dimensional reference on CAD for the area where the rear lights were, so that we've got that reference and we've got that edge as CAD data, so that when we machine those bezels, if you like, or the rear lamp holder units in aluminium, they will all fit the fiberglass of the remaining the edges, the key parts of the car, the edges here that we're not fiddling with. Those aluminium units will fit those exactly. So we've recorded all the shape prior to then cutting out the part where the lamp's mounted originally. So that's where we're going with that. We've done a little bit of work on the bonnet, just sorting out a couple of parts on the inside of the bonnet, and probably not a lot yet. The plan at the moment is to focus on obviously making sure the bonnet still fits the car. Making sure all the edges are correct on the bonnet, but not putting too much time into that at the moment, because we want to try and get the main body tub moulded first. get that to the stage where that can be made in carbon prior to pushing too far ahead with all the other parts. Because we know that they're going to be significantly easier than the main part, which is the body tub. That's going to be what eats an awful lot of time up. And there's quite a lot of detail work and quite a lot of detailed discussion was had with Pete in terms of how to mould quite a lot of the return sections on this body, because they are quite complicated. The structure on these cars is such that there's a main chassis tub, and then the two sides, the metal parts that are in the sides of the car that include the door shuts, are actually a separate metal side frame that bolts to the chassis, but then is enclosed into and screwed into the fiberglass mouldings. And where the metal body side frames screw into the fiberglass, it's actually quite a complicated area, and there's quite a lot of complicated parts in the moulds. And so we were going through with Pete exactly how all the returns and all the split lines would be done on the mould to enable us to keep all that how we wanted it. We talked about various bits of redesign that could be done. The problem is if we go into too much redesign, the costs go from eye-watering to not having any eyes to water. So we've had to sort of try and rein things into a level where it's actually doable and not just unfeasibly expensive. So we think we've got a pretty good plan. What I will say is that, and we're all on the same page on this, is that when the car has gone to KS, there's bound to be some toing and froing between us and KS on exactly how we're going to complete some of the areas of it. One of the complications is that we may well break the buck, getting that off the car. And that we would need to mould, for example, this rail here sits into a sort of recess in the fiberglass. In order to mould that, we need a separate piece of a mould that bolts in. And in order to be able to take the mould of that, we have to release the body from the side frame. And in order to release the body, we may break the body getting it off the side frame. So there's an order of events in making sure that we've got datums for everything, so that if something gets broken, we haven't lost all our references and knackered ourselves up, basically. So it's quite complicated. There's going to be plenty of problems to solve yet. But we feel a bit better having had a good chat with Pete and having had a good work through the ideas of how the principles of how we're going to mould everything. I think we've certainly got a plan, and it's not too far down the line now before we'll be able to enact that plan. I can't remember, there's probably plenty of other bits in here that I've forgotten, but we'll worry about those next week because I've waffled on enough. So thank you all for watching, and yeah, we'll see you all in a week's time.